The black uniform, the twin lightning bolts on the collar, the death's head insignia. These were not merely military symbols. They were psychological weapons designed to inspire terror before a single shot was fired. The Waffen-SS had fought on every front of the Second World War, from the frozen steppes of the Soviet Union to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the mountains of Italy to the killing fields of the Balkans. They had been Hitler's elite, the ideological warriors of the Third Reich, soldiers who were supposed to embody the racial and military supremacy of National Socialism made flesh. Then, in May 1945, it was over. And for nearly 1 million men who had worn that uniform, the question of what came next. What happened to the soldiers of the most criminal military organization in history after the civilization that created them collapsed into rubble was one of the most complicated, most contested, and most morally uncomfortable questions of the entire post-war era. Because the Waffen-SS did not simply disappear in 1945. They surrendered. They were tried, they were released, they organized, they lobbied, they collected pensions, they wrote memoirs. They built memorials. They fought not with weapons this time, but with words, with politics, with carefully constructed historical narratives to make the world remember them as soldiers rather than war criminals. And for decades, to a degree that should disturb anyone who examines it carefully, they succeeded. This is the story of that last battle. The battle not for territory or military objectives, but for history itself. The surrender came in pieces. Across the shattered landscape of Europe in the final weeks of May 1945, units of the Waffen-SS were laying down their arms to American, British, and Soviet forces. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the division that had begun as Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment and grown into one of the most powerful armored formations in the German military. Das Reich, the division whose soldiers had massacred 642 civilians at Oradour-sur-Glane in France in June 1944. The Totenkopf, the Death's Head division, formed originally from concentration camp guards. The Hitlerjugend, the 12th SS Panzer Division, composed largely of teenage boys fanatically devoted to a Führer who was already dead. One by one, in fields and forests and along roadsides across Germany, Austria, France, Italy and Czechoslovakia, these men removed their weapons and raised their hands. The uniforms that had made them symbols of terror just weeks before now made them targets. Allied soldiers who had fought them knew exactly what the insignia meant. Soviet soldiers who had seen what SS units did on the Eastern Front sometimes made no distinction between capture and execution. Those who survived the immediate aftermath of surrender were marched into captivity, often in the open air, in hastily constructed enclosures that could barely be called camps. The conditions were brutal. Tens of thousands of prisoners crowded into spaces designed for a fraction of that number, exposed to the elements, surviving on minimal rations, struggling with disease and despair. Allied authorities, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what they were managing, millions of prisoners, a continent in ruins, the immediate demands of occupation and reconstruction, focused their limited prosecutorial resources on identifying the most notorious offenders. The legal reckoning, when it came formally, was delivered at Nuremberg. The International Military Tribunal that convened in Nuremberg from November 1945 to October 1946 was tasked with something unprecedented. Not merely punishing individual war criminals, but judging entire organizations. The SS was one of them. The prosecution's case was comprehensive and damning. The SS had operated the concentration camp system. The SS had provided the personnel for the Einsatzgruppen. Das Reich, the division whose soldiers had massacred 642 civilians at Oradour-sur-Glane in France in June 1944. The Totenkopf, the Death's Head division, formed originally from concentration camp guards. The Hitlerjugend, the 12th SS Panzer Division, composed largely of teenage boys fanatically devoted to a Führer who was already dead. One by one, in fields and forests and along roadsides across Germany, Austria, France, Italy and Czechoslovakia, these men removed their weapons and raised their hands. The uniforms that had made them symbols of terror just weeks before now made them targets. Allied soldiers who had fought them knew exactly what the insignia meant. Soviet soldiers who had seen what SS units did on the Eastern Front sometimes made no distinction between capture and execution. Those who survived the immediate aftermath of surrender were marched into captivity, often in the open air, in hastily constructed enclosures that could barely be called camps. The conditions were brutal. Tens of thousands of prisoners crowded into spaces designed for a fraction of that number, exposed to the elements, surviving on minimal rations, struggling with disease and despair. Allied authorities, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what they were managing, millions of prisoners, a continent in ruins, the immediate demands of occupation and reconstruction, focused their limited prosecutorial resources on identifying the most notorious offenders. The legal reckoning, when it came formally, was delivered at Nuremberg. The International Military Tribunal that convened in Nuremberg from November 1945 to October 1946 was tasked with something unprecedented, not merely punishing individual war criminals, but judging entire organizations. The SS was one of them. The prosecution's case was comprehensive and damning. The SS had operated the concentration camp system. The SS had provided the personnel for the Einsatzgruppen, the Spruchkammern that had been established across occupied Germany to sort the Nazi-era population into categories ranging from major offenders to mere followers. For most lower-ranking Waffen-SS members, the process resulted in relatively minor penalties. Some faced brief imprisonment, fines, or restrictions on employment. Many were released within months of the war's end, their records marked but their physical freedom restored. By 1947, hundreds of thousands of men who had worn the SS uniform were walking free in defeated Germany, facing a future that was uncertain in every dimension: economic, social, legal, and moral. Not everyone waited for the Allied justice system to process them. A minority of Waffen-SS officers, particularly those with significant blood on their hands, who had reason to believe that the Nuremberg exceptions would not protect them, chose flight. What followed became one of the most controversial and extensively documented escape operations in post-war history: the ratlines. The ratlines were networks, partly organized, partly improvised, that moved former SS officers and other Nazi war criminals out of Europe and into new lives in South America, the Middle East, and elsewhere. The routes ran typically through Italy, where sympathetic Catholic clergy, acting in some cases from genuine humanitarian concern and in others from anti-communist political calculation, provided false papers, safe houses, and assistance in obtaining international Red Cross travel documents. From Italian ports, fugitives sailed to Argentina, to Paraguay, to Brazil, to Syria, to Egypt. Karl Nicolussi-Lech, a former panzer commander who had served in the Waffen-SS, reached Argentina in 1948, where he built a quiet and comfortable life under the government of Juan Perón, who was actively recruiting former German military personnel. He was not alone. The extent to which these escapes were systematically organized, and particularly the extent to which American, British, and Vatican institutions knowingly facilitated them in exchange for intelligence against the Soviet Union, remains one of the most contested questions in the historiography of the post-war period. What is documented is that the escapes happened, that they were numerous, and that many of the men who escaped faced no justice for their wartime actions. For those who remained in Germany and Austria, the majority, the ratlines were not an option. They were left to navigate the post-war order with the weight of their wartime service following them everywhere. The early post-war years in West Germany were, for former Waffen-SS men, a period of grinding difficulty and profound social stigma. The name Waffen-SS had become, in the immediate post-war consciousness, synonymous with the worst of the Nazi regime. In 1948, 3 years after the war's end, the organization was still formally classified as criminal. Its veterans were excluded from civil service employment, from state pensions, from the war grave commemorations that were beginning to honor regular Wehrmacht dead. They existed in a legal and social limbo, too numerous to imprison, too tainted to integrate. Many returned to ruined towns and cities in Germany and Austria to find that the social networks that had sustained them before the war had been destroyed. Families had been killed or displaced. Communities were rebuilding under Allied occupation that was actively discouraging the rehabilitation of Nazi-era figures. Employment was scarce even for men without an SS record. For those who had one, it was scarcer still. Some drifted through the displaced persons camps that dotted the Allied occupation zones. Vast, improvised communities of people who had nowhere specific to go in a continent that had been torn from its foundations. Others found work in manual labor, in construction, in the factories that were beginning the process of rebuilding West Germany's shattered industrial base. Their military discipline and the networks of comrades, men who had served in the same units and now found each other in the same ruined cities, sometimes helped them secure employment. The stigma lingered, but survival was immediate and practical necessity trumped ideology. The fundamental injustice, as many of them experienced it, was one of comparison. Regular Wehrmacht veterans, soldiers who had served in the German army rather than the SS, were gradually being reintegrated into West German society. War widows received pensions, disabled veterans received support. The mainstream military dead were being commemorated. But the men of the Waffen-SS were excluded from these processes, their service treated as categorically different, their sacrifices, as they understood their wartime experiences, officially unrecognized. The sense of grievance was, in retrospect, morally grotesque. The Waffen-SS had been a criminal organization that had participated in genocide. The distinction between its veterans and regular Wehrmacht soldiers was not an arbitrary injustice, but a reflection of documented historical reality. But for men who had spent years being told that they were the elite, the chosen, the ideological warriors of a civilization, and who had, in many cases, convinced themselves that their own service had been purely military rather than ideological, the post-war exclusion felt like persecution. That feeling of persecution would become the foundation of everything that followed. In 1951, 6 years after the war ended, and 2 years after the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany, a group of former Waffen-SS officers met and founded an organization that would shape West German politics, historical memory, and the public rehabilitation of the SS for the next 4 decades. They called it HIAG, Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members. Its founders were not obscure foot soldiers. They were former generals, Paul Hausser, who had commanded SS Panzer Corps on the Eastern Front, Otto Kumm, who had commanded the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Felix Steiner, who had led SS Corps in the Soviet Union. These were men of organizational ability, political sophistication, and absolute conviction that history had treated them unjustly. HIAG's stated purpose was welfare, to support former Waffen-SS men who had been denied the pensions and benefits available to regular veterans. This was, in its narrow practical sense, a genuine concern. Thousands of former SS men were living in genuine poverty, excluded from the support systems that the West German state was constructing for its veteran population. But HIAG's ambitions extended far beyond welfare. Almost immediately, the organization began operating as a political lobby and a historical revisionist enterprise of considerable sophistication. Its central argument, developed refined, and propagated with the systematic efficiency of men who had spent years running military organizations, was elegant in its simplicity. The Waffen-SS had been soldiers. Nothing more, nothing less. They had fought for Germany. As soldiers fight for their countries, the atrocities associated with the SS name had been committed by the concentration camp guards, the security police, the Einsatzgruppen, the other branches of Himmler's empire. The combat soldiers of the Waffen-SS had been warriors, not murderers. To hold them responsible for crimes they had not personally committed was injustice, not justice. This argument was, in its historical essentials, false. The Waffen-SS had not been a separate military organization that happened to share a name with the criminal apparatus of Himmler's SS empire. It had been an integral part of that empire, ideologically formed by it, operationally connected to it, and directly involved in some of its worst crimes. Waffen-SS units had participated in the massacre of civilians across occupied Europe. They had operated alongside the Einsatzgruppen. They had been present at, and in many cases active participants in, atrocities that the Nuremberg tribunal had specifically cited in its declaration of the SS as a criminal organization. But the argument was not designed to withstand historical scrutiny. It was designed to be politically effective, and in the specific circumstances of early 1950s West Germany, it was extraordinarily effective. West Germany in the early 1950s was a democracy under construction, fragile, dependent on American support, and operating in a political environment where millions of former Nazi Party members and SS veterans were voters whose support any governing party needed to secure. Konrad Adenauer, West Germany's first chancellor, was a committed Democrat and anti-Nazi who had spent the war years in internal exile. He was also a ruthlessly practical politician who understood that the Federal Republic could not be built on the political exclusion of millions of Germans who had, to varying degrees, been part of the Nazi system. His government included former Nazi Party members in significant positions. His justice ministry was staffed with lawyers who had served the Third Reich's legal apparatus. This was not admirable. It was, in Adenauer's calculation, necessary. HIAG understood and exploited this dynamic with considerable skill. Its leaders cultivated relationships with conservative politicians, particularly within Adenauer's CDU and the Bavarian CSU. They mobilized their members as voters. They made clear that the welfare and recognition demands of former SS veterans were political issues with electoral consequences. The results were significant. In 1953, Adenauer made his famous public statement that the men of the Waffen-SS had fought as soldiers, just like others, a statement that carried enormous symbolic weight, effectively legitimizing the HIAG narrative at the highest level of the West German state. The Federal War Victims Relief Act had already been passed in 1950, providing support for disabled veterans and war widows. The question of whether its benefits should extend to Waffen-SS veterans was fiercely contested. Survivor organizations and left-leaning politicians argued passionately that men who had served in a criminal organization should not receive state support equivalent to regular soldiers. But the political pressure from HIAG and the conservative politicians who courted its membership ultimately prevailed. By the mid-1950s, former SS men could claim limited pension benefits, particularly those who could demonstrate post-1943 conscription. The question of whether former SS men could serve in the newly established Bundeswehr, West Germany's new military, created in 1956 as part of the NATO alliance, was equally charged. The official answer was yes in theory. In practice, of the 3,117 former Waffen-SS members who applied, only 508 were accepted. Allied advisors, concerned about the Bundeswehr inheriting a tainted legacy, exercised significant pressure against mass SS re-enlistment. Those who were accepted quietly buried their wartime pasts, becoming part of a new military that was officially committed to democratic values and the lessons of the Nazi catastrophe. HIAG's most lasting contribution to the post-war world was not political but cultural. The construction of a myth about the Waffen-SS that proved remarkably durable, despite being demonstrably false. The myth was built through a sustained campaign of publication, commemoration, and historical revisionism that operated throughout the 1950s and 1960s. HIAG published a magazine, Der Freiwillige, the Volunteer, that reached tens of thousands of readers and consistently promoted the narrative of the Waffen-SS as an elite but purely military force, unjustly condemned for crimes committed by other branches of the SS. It financed the publication of memoirs by former SS officers that emphasized military professionalism and camaraderie, while minimizing or entirely omitting the ideological dimension of their service. The cornerstone of this literary rehabilitation was Paul Hausser's 1953 book, Soldaten wie andere auch, Soldiers Like Any Other. Hausser was a former SS general who had commanded formations at some of the most brutal engagements on the Eastern Front. His book argued, with the authority of a senior military officer writing from personal experience, that the Waffen-SS had been a military force comparable to any other, that its soldiers had fought professionally, had not been involved in ideological crimes, and had been condemned not for what they actually did but for the uniform they wore. The book sold extensively. It was cited by politicians defending SS pension rights. It was referenced in newspaper editorials. It became, for a generation of West Germans who had either served in the SS or had family members who had, a definitive statement of their case. The fact that it was historically misleading, that Hausser's own command had been implicated in atrocities that he did not mention, was not immediately apparent to its readers, and was not, in the political climate of 1950s West Germany, widely reported. HIAG organized annual reunions where former SS veterans gathered to commemorate their divisions, events that were, in the 1950s and early 1960s, often covered by local media without significant criticism. Former SS officers were invited to address local political gatherings. Some managed to secure public positions. The myth was being normalized, quietly and persistently, through the thousands small acts of social legitimization that collectively constitute historical memory. The myth could not hold forever. West Germany's post-war silence about the Nazi period, the collective decision to look forward rather than backward, to rebuild rather than remember, to prioritize economic recovery over moral reckoning, began to break down in the late 1950s and accelerated dramatically through the 1960s and 1970s, as a younger generation demanded confrontation with the past that their parents had preferred to bury. The Eichmann trial in 1961, the prosecution of the SS officer who had coordinated the logistics of the Holocaust, captured in Argentina by Israeli intelligence and tried in Jerusalem, forced the Holocaust back into public consciousness with devastating clarity. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963, 6-5 put concentration camp personnel in the dock and produced testimony that made the systematic nature of the killing impossible to deny or minimize. As historical scholarship advanced, the specific claims of the HIAG myth began to be systematically demolished. Archives opened. Survivor testimonies accumulated. Researchers examining the operational records of specific Waffen-SS divisions documented their participation in massacres, reprisal killings, and collaboration with the Einsatzgruppen with a precision that the HIAG narrative could not survive. In 1978, a Der Spiegel investigation exposed HIAG's deep political connections and its systematic efforts to pressure politicians on pension reforms and to influence how the Waffen-SS was depicted in school textbooks and public commemorations. The investigation revealed an organization that had been operating for nearly 30 years as a sophisticated political lobby designed to rehabilitate a criminal organization. mainstream political parties began to distance themselves. The CDU and CSU politicians who had addressed HIAG rallies in the 1950s and 1960s now found the association politically toxic. HIAG continued to exist, fighting increasingly defensive battles over memorials, cemetery plaques, and pension regulations sustained by aging veterans who refused to accept the historical verdict that the accumulated scholarship of 3 decades had delivered. By the 1980s, anti-fascist organizations were regularly protesting Waffen-SS reunions. The public tolerance that had allowed HIAG to operate in relative comfort for 30 years had evaporated. In 1992, HIAG officially dissolved. Its membership had aged and diminished. Its political allies had abandoned it. Its central historical argument had been refuted by decades of scholarship. The organization that had spent 4 decades fighting to rehabilitate the Waffen-SS died quietly, leaving behind a changed landscape, one in which the myth that had so carefully constructed had been substantially dismantled, but not entirely destroyed. When HIAG dissolved in 1992, many assumed the Waffen-SS debate would finally recede into history. They were wrong. The reunification of Germany in 1989, 9/0, and the opening of archives that had been inaccessible during the Cold War produced a new wave of scholarship that further demolished the clean Wehrmacht and clean Waffen-SS myths. Historians like Sonke Neitzel and Peter Longerich produced detailed analysis of how ideology, discipline, and violence had been fused within the Waffen-SS structure from its inception, demonstrating conclusively that the organization had never been the apolitical military force that HIAG had claimed. But historical truth and political reality continued to diverge in troubling ways. In the 1990s, journalists discovered that some former Waffen-SS members were still receiving state pensions under the old Federal War Victims Relief Act. Pensions that had been established in the legal compromises of the early 1950s and that had proved extremely difficult to revoke. Reports in Der Spiegel and the New York Times sparked outrage, particularly when placed alongside the documented inadequacy of compensation paid to Holocaust survivors. The moral obscenity of the comparison, perpetrators receiving state support while victims had been denied equivalent recognition, was stark and undeniable. Successive German governments acknowledged the problem and struggled to address it, constrained by legal frameworks that had been built on the political compromises of the post-war decades. Outside Germany, the Waffen-SS legacy took on forms that could not have been anticipated in 1945. In the Baltic states and Ukraine, countries that had experienced both Nazi and Soviet occupation and that were, in the post-Soviet period, constructing national identities that required heroes from their recent past, veterans of the locally recruited SS divisions began to be commemorated as national freedom fighters. Annual marches in Riga honoring veterans of the Latvian SS divisions drew international condemnation from Jewish organizations and the European Parliament. These commemorations were not, their organizers argued, celebrations of Nazi ideology, but recognition of men who had fought against Soviet occupation. The argument was not without historical complexity, but it was impossible to separate from the reality that these men had worn SS uniforms and served in an organization formally declared criminal at Nuremberg. Inside Germany, the legal framework was unambiguous. Displaying SS symbols was prohibited under Section 86A of the Criminal Code. Open admiration for the Waffen-SS was by the early 2000s a social and legal taboo. But online, in the far-right digital ecosystems that had developed since the 1990s, SS imagery continued to circulate. The Waffen-SS continued to be portrayed as models of military excellence and ideological purity, and the HIAG myth continued to be propagated in new forms to new audiences. German authorities have prosecuted these cases repeatedly and have been explicit about why. Not merely because the symbols are offensive, but because their continued use represents a live threat to democratic values. A demonstration that the last battle of the Waffen-SS, the battle for historical memory, has not been definitively won. Today, the last surviving members of the Waffen-SS are gone, or nearly so. The men who wore the black uniform are now figures of history rather than participants in the present. The organizations they built to defend their reputation have dissolved. The political world that enabled their rehabilitation has been substantially transformed by decades of confrontation with the Nazi past. And yet, the debate continues. In archives and academic journals, in courtrooms and legislatures, in online forums and national conversations about memory and identity. The questions raised by the Waffen-SS and its post-war history refuse to resolve themselves into settled conclusions. How does a society reintegrate the perpetrators of mass atrocity after the atrocity ends? How does it balance the practical necessity of social reconstruction with the moral imperative of accountability? How does it prevent the gradual normalization of evil through the thousand small acts of accommodation that each seem reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in combination? West Germany's experience with the Waffen-SS veterans does not provide clean answers to these questions. It provides a cautionary case study in how easily history can be reshaped by organized political pressure, how effectively perpetrators can reframe their own actions when given the social and political space to do so, and how long the consequences of moral compromise in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe can echo through the decades that follow. 80 years after the black uniforms were laid down in the rubble of the Third Reich, the men who wore them are still, in some sense, fighting their last battle. Not in the fields where they once killed and died, in the stories that are told about them, in the arguments that still rage about what they were, what they did, and what they deserve to be called. History has delivered its verdict on the Waffen-SS. The problem is that history's verdicts require constant defense against the organized forgetting of those who find them inconvenient, against the political pressures of those who need heroes from among the guilty, and against the simple human tendency to prefer comfortable myths over uncomfortable truths. The last battle of the Waffen-SS was fought not with rifles and tanks. It was fought with books and lobbying and pension laws and memorial plaques and annual reunions of aging men who needed to believe they had been soldiers, like any other. They were not soldiers like any other. The evidence has always been there, in the archives, in the survivor testimonies, in the records of the courts that judged them. The work of keeping that evidence visible, of ensuring that the verdict of history is not gradually eroded by the patient, persistent myth-making of those who lost the war but never accepted the judgment, is work that never fully ends.